Paul's olive tree metaphor in Romans 11 is frequently interpreted as describing the conversion of pagans who had no prior connection to Israel's covenant world. According to this view, the wild branches grafted into the olive tree represent Gentiles drawn directly from the pagan nations and incorporated into the people of God. Yet when the metaphor is examined carefully within its literary, historical, and scriptural context, this interpretation becomes difficult to sustain. Several features of Paul's argument suggest that the grafted branches were not completely unrelated pagans, but individuals who already existed within Israel's religious orbit. The root of this tree represents the patriarchal promises given to his descendants, which weren't necessarily physical descendants. Paul emphasizes that the grafted branches now share in the nourishing root that sustains the tree. Participation in the root, therefore, involves participation in Israel's covenant promises. This raises an important question. What kind of people would need access to the blessings that flow from Israel's covenant root? The benefits associated with the patriarchal promises are not generic religious privileges. Paul earlier describes Israel's covenant privileges in Romans 9:4-5 as including the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the worship, and the promises. These blessings belong specifically to Israel's covenant story. What would pagan non-Israelites need such blessings? N.T. Wright emphasizes that Paul's argument throughout Romans 9-11 remains centered on Israel's covenant identity. The olive tree remains Israel's tree. What Paul describes is the reshaping of Israel around the Messiah. Source, Wright, Paul and the Faithfulness of God, page 1239. Similarly, scholar Richard Hayes notes that Paul's discussion is fundamentally about Israel's covenant story. Romans 9-11 is fundamentally about the question of God's faithfulness to Israel. Source, Hayes, Echoes of Scripture. In the Letters of Paul, page 64. Paul's argument also assumes that his audience is familiar with Israel's scriptures and covenant history. Throughout chapters 9-11, he repeatedly references Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the patriarchal promises, and the prophetic hope of Israel's restoration. Such references presuppose readers who already understand Israel's story and recognize the significance of these covenant themes. It would be unusual for Paul to assume this level of scriptural familiarity if his audience consisted primarily of pagans with no prior exposure to Israel's religious world. In Romans 11:18, Paul also warns the grafted branches not to boast over the natural branches. Do not be arrogant toward the branches. This warning presupposes a shared covenant structure in which both groups now participate. The arrogance Paul cautions against would arise if newly incorporated participants began to view themselves as superior to Israelites who were broken off because of unbelief. In Romans 11:11, Paul further explains that the inclusion of Gentiles serves to provoke Israel to jealousy. This dynamic becomes historically understandable when viewed within the context of synagogue communities throughout the Jewish diaspora. Historian Paula Fredrickson notes, synagogues were open to non-Jews who were attracted to the God of Israel and participated in varying degrees in Jewish communal life. Source, Fredrickson, Paul, The Pagan's Apostle, page 98. Martin Hengel similarly observes the widespread attraction of Gentiles to Judaism. Large numbers of Gentiles were drawn to Judaism and attached themselves to the synagogue communities without fully converting. Source, Hengel, Judaism and Hellenism, Volume 1, page 307. These individuals were commonly known as God-fearers, non-Israelites who worshipped Israel's God and associated themselves with synagogue communities. Some eventually became proselytes, formally converting to Judaism through circumcision and full covenant participation. Shea J. D. Cohen explains the significance of such conversion. In the eyes of the Gentiles, the proselyte has become a Jew. Source: Cohen, The Beginnings of Jewishness, page 140. Scholars have also noted that the early Jesus movement drew heavily from this population of Gentiles already attached to Israel's religious life. Richard Borkham writes, "Gentiles who came to faith in the God of Israel did not enter a separate religious system. They were incorporated into Israel's own story and hopes." Source: Borkham, Bible and Mission, page 72. John M. G. Barclay similarly explains Paul's understanding of Gentile inclusion. Paul does not imagine Gentiles forming a new people unrelated to Israel. They are incorporated into Israel's story through participation in the promises given to Abraham. Source: Barclay, Paul and the Gift, page 383. Finally, Paul's metaphor maintains the possibility that broken natural branches can be grafted back into the tree. He says in Romans 11:23, God has the power to graft them in again. C.E.B. Cranfield observes, the broken branches are not finally rejected, the possibility of their restoration remains open. Source: Cranfield, A Critical and Exegetical Commentary on Romans, Volume 2, page 566. This restoration language reinforces the continuity of Israel's covenant structure throughout the metaphor. The olive tree remains Israel's tree, and the reshaping of its branches reflects developments within Israel's covenant story rather than the creation of an entirely new religious people detached from Israel. Taken together, these features suggest that the grafted branches were not pagans with no prior link to Israel. Instead, they represent individuals who already existed within Israel's religious orbit, people who honored Israel's God, participated in Jewish communal life, and were familiar with Israel's scriptures. In the historical setting of the 1st century, such individuals are most naturally identified with the God-fearers and proselytes who were attached to synagogue communities throughout the Jewish diaspora. Paul's olive tree metaphor therefore describes the reconfiguration of Israel's covenant community during the crisis he addresses in Romans 9-11. Natural Israelites who believe remain in the tree. Unbelieving Israelites are broken off, yet remain capable of restoration. And covenantally attached outsiders, rather than completely unrelated pagans, are grafted into the same covenant tree and share in the nourishment of the patriarchal promises. Why the grafted-in branches weren't descendants of the 10 northern tribes? The idea that the grafted branches represent descendants of the lost northern tribes has been proposed by some interpreters, especially those who emphasize the prophetic theme of Israel's restoration. However, several features of Paul's metaphor make that explanation less likely than the interpretation that the grafted branches represent non-native participants who became covenantally attached to Israel, such as God-fearers and proselytes. In the metaphor, the natural branches represent Israelites by origin, those who belonged natively to the covenant people. If the grafted branches were also Israelites by descent, such as descendants of the northern tribes, they would logically belong to the same category of natural branches. Paul's distinction between natural branches and wild branches therefore indicates a difference in origin rather than merely a difference in covenant status. Second, Paul describes the grafted branches as coming from a wild olive tree. In horticultural terms, a wild olive shoot grows outside the cultivated orchard and is not part of the original stock. The image therefore emphasizes that the grafted branches originate outside the cultivated tree that represents Israel. If the grafted branches were Israelites by descent, descendants of the northern tribes, they would still belong to the cultivated stock and would naturally be described as natural branches rather than wild ones. Third, the historical setting of the 1st century provides a clear social category that fits Paul's description of non-native branches attached to Israel's covenant life. Diaspora synagogue communities regularly included non-Israelites who worshipped the God of Israel and participated in Jewish communal life. As E. P. Sanders observes, large numbers of Gentiles were attracted to Judaism and associated themselves with Jewish communities without necessarily becoming full converts. Source: Sanders, Paul and Palestinian Judaism, page 96. These covenantally attached outsiders match the logic of Paul's metaphor closely. They were not native members of Israel's lineage, yet they were capable of being incorporated into Israel's covenant community. Finally, Paul repeatedly emphasizes that participation in the tree depends on faith rather than ancestry. In Romans 11:20, Paul said, "You stand by faith." This principle allows for the inclusion of individuals who did not originate within Israel's lineage, but who nevertheless share in the covenant promises through faith. At the same time, it explains how natural branches, Israelites by birth, can be removed if they persist in unbelief. For these reasons, the metaphor works more naturally if the grafted branches represent non-native participants who became covenantally attached to Israel's covenant life. Part 3. Why the branches grafted in were non-native but covenantally attached outsiders. Paul's olive tree metaphor ultimately describes a restructuring within Israel's covenant community itself. The imagery distinguishes between natural branches, broken branches, and branches grafted in from outside. Natural branches represent Israelites who belonged natively to the covenant people. Some of these were broken off because of unbelief, while others remained attached to the tree through faith. Alongside these natural branches, Paul introduces wild olive shoots, branches originating outside the cultivated stock, yet capable of being grafted into the tree and sharing in its nourishment. The metaphor, therefore, maintains the continuity of Israel's covenant identity even while describing the reconfiguration of its membership. The tree itself is never replaced, nor is a second tree introduced. Instead, Paul depicts outsiders being incorporated into the existing covenant structure rooted in the patriarchal promises. As James D. G. Dunn observes, the olive tree represents the historic people of God, and Paul's point is not the replacement of Israel, but the reordering of its membership. The olive tree clearly represents the historical people of God. The metaphor describes not the replacement of Israel, but the reconstitution of the people of God around the Messiah. Source: Dunn, Romans 9-16, Word Biblical Commentary, page 676. Within this framework, the grafted branches must represent people capable of being incorporated into Israel's covenant life. In the historical setting of the 1st century, the most natural candidates are the non-Israelites already attached to Jewish communities throughout the diaspora, individuals commonly known as God-fearers and proselytes. These people worshipped the God of Israel, participated in synagogue life, and were familiar with Israel's scriptures even though they were not Israelites by birth. Their incorporation into the covenant community through the gospel would therefore fit the logic of Paul's metaphor: branches from outside the cultivated stock grafted into Israel's tree. Scholars of early Christianity frequently note that the early Jesus movement drew heavily from this population of Gentiles already connected to Jewish religious life. Richard Bauckham explains that Gentile believers were not envisioned as forming a separate religious community detached from Israel. Gentiles who came to faith in the God of Israel did not enter a separate religious system. They were incorporated into Israel's own story and hopes. Source: Bauckham, Bible and Mission, page 72. John M.G. Barclay similarly emphasizes that Paul understood Gentile inclusion as participation in Israel's existing covenant promises rather than the creation of a new people unrelated to Israel. Paul does not imagine Gentiles forming a new people unrelated to Israel. They are incorporated into Israel's story through participation in the promises given to Abraham. Source: Barclay, Paul and the Gift, page 383. This understanding also clarifies the logic of Paul's warning to the grafted branches not to boast over the natural branches per Romans 11:18. The warning assumes that both groups now share the same covenant structure and draw nourishment from the same patriarchal root. Gentile arrogance would arise if newly incorporated participants began to view themselves as superior to Israelites who were broken off because of unbelief. Such tension is historically plausible in communities where non-Israelites who had previously existed on the margins of Jewish religious life now found themselves sharing fully in Israel's covenant promises. N.T. Wright summarizes the overall significance of Paul's metaphor in precisely these terms. The olive tree remains Israel's tree. What Paul describes is the reshaping of Israel around the Messiah. Source: Wright, Paul and the Faithfulness of God, page 1239. The olive tree image therefore portrays the reshaping of Israel's covenant community during the crisis Paul addresses in Romans 9-11. Believing Israelites remain in the tree. Unbelieving Israelites are broken off, yet remain capable of restoration. And non-native but covenantally attached participants, such as God-fearers and proselytes, are grafted into the same covenant structure and share in the nourishment of the patriarchal promises. In this way, the metaphor does not describe the creation of a new people detached from Israel, nor a distinct class of people within Israel which is required for those grafted in to be from the 10 northern tribes. The cultivated tree remains Israel's tree, rooted in the promises given to the patriarchs, while its branches, natural and grafted, represent those who participate in that covenant life through faith, even though they have from different origins.